My family treated me like an outsider my whole life. Now I inherited everything, and they're losing their minds. I'm a 28-year-old man, and I grew up knowing I wasn't wanted. I have two older brothers, Ethan, who is 35, and Caleb, who is 33. They were always the golden children of the family. My mother adored them. My father was proud of them. The extended family doted on them. Me, I was just there. From a young age, it was clear I was treated differently. Ethan and Caleb got new bikes for Christmas while I got socks. They got money for extracurriculars, and I was told to find something free to do. They each had their own spacious rooms. I got a tiny storage room in the basement. I remember once, when I was about 10, I asked my mother why she treated me differently. She sighed and said, "Some kids just have to work harder for love." That answer stuck with me for years. By the time I was a teenager, I stopped trying. Nothing I did ever impressed them. I got a 4.0 GPA. My mother shrugged and said, "Well, Caleb is naturally smart. He doesn't have to try as hard as you." I got my first job at 16. My father called me independent, but still gave my brothers allowances, even though they were in their 20s. When it came time for college, my parents paid for Ethan and Caleb's tuition, apartments, and even cars. Me, I was told, "You're on your own." So I worked my ass off, got scholarships, and moved out at 18. I rarely spoke to them again. Over the years, I heard bits and pieces from extended family. Ethan and Caleb had gone through job after job, constantly borrowing money from our parents. My mother defended them, saying they just need time to find their path. Meanwhile, my father apparently had a change of heart. I later learned he had tried to reach out to me, but my mother forgot to pass on the messages. Then, a few months ago, my father passed away. I hadn't spoken to him in over a decade, but I still felt a pang of sadness. He was never outright cruel to me, just passive. A background character in my childhood. I didn't expect anything from his will. In fact, I almost didn't even attend the reading. That's when my world turned upside down. My father left everything to me, the house, the savings, his shares in a business, everything. At first, I thought it was a mistake. But then the lawyer handed me a letter my father had written before he passed. In it, he apologized for not standing up for me. He admitted he had been weak, letting my mother and brothers push me aside. He wrote that he had seen, over the years, how Ethan and Caleb treated me, how they leached off the family without ever giving anything back. He said he knew if he left them anything, they would squander it. He left everything to me because I was the only one he trusted. I was still processing this when my mother and brothers found out. To say they lost their minds would be an understatement. Ethan and Caleb started shouting about how I was a selfish, greedy bastard who had somehow tricked Dad. My mother screamed at the lawyer, demanding to see the will. When she realized it was legally airtight, she turned on me. "You ungrateful brat, you have to split it. It's their birthright." I just sat there, silent. For the first time in my life, I had power in a situation with them, and I watched as they showed their true colors. Ethan pointed a finger in my face, eyes bloodshot with rage. "You wouldn't even have this money if Dad hadn't raised you. You owe us." That's when something inside me snapped. I stood up, looked at all of them and said, "I don't owe you anything." Then I walked out. Now, they won't stop calling me. My mother has been leaving voicemails sobbing about how I'm tearing the family apart. Caleb sent a long email about how it's cruel to leave them with nothing, conveniently ignoring the fact that they both received years of financial support while I got nothing. Even extended family is getting involved, telling me to be the bigger person. These same people knew how I was treated growing up, but now that money is involved, suddenly it's about family unity. Part of me wonders if I should just give them something to make them go away. But another part of me, the part that spent nights crying as a kid, wondering why I wasn't good enough, wants to finally put myself first. I don't know. What would you do? I knew my family would be angry when they found out I inherited everything. I just didn't expect them to completely lose their minds. I made the mistake of thinking they'd cool off after a few days. Maybe they'd accept that my father made his choice and I'd finally be free of them. I was wrong. The calls started that night. At first, it was my mother. She left a series of voicemails alternating between sobbing and screaming. "I carried you for 9 months, And this is how you repay me? You're tearing this family apart. How could you do this to your own brothers? If your father could see you now, he'd be ashamed of you. That last one almost made me laugh. If my father was ashamed of me, he wouldn't have left me everything. Then came Ethan and Caleb. Unlike my mother, they didn't even bother pretending to be hurt. They went straight to rage and threats. You think this is over? You better fix this, or I swear to God, you'll regret it. You wouldn't even have that money if Dad hadn't raised you. You owe us. You think you deserve this? You were never part of this family anyway. I blocked their numbers. I thought ignoring them would make them go away. It only made things worse. A few days later, I woke up to an explosion of notifications, dozens of texts, messages from old classmates, distant relatives, even coworkers. My mother had gone full Facebook meltdown mode. She posted a long, dramatic rant about how her ungrateful son had stolen everything and left his poor, hard-working brothers with nothing. She made it sound like I had somehow tricked my father on his deathbed, ripping away their inheritance. The comments were a mix of outrage and support. Some people blindly took her side. How could a son do this to his own mother? Your father would be so disappointed. You should take him to court. But others called her out on her bullshit. Wait, didn't OP's brothers mooch off their dad for years? I thought OP was always treated like an outsider. Maybe their dad had a reason for what he did. Sounds like OP is the only responsible one. Of course, my mother deleted any comments that defended me, but the damage was done. Now people I barely knew were blowing up my phone, demanding to know my side of the story. I didn't respond. I refused to play their game. A few days later, I was in a work meeting when security called me down to the lobby. Ethan was there. I don't know how he found out where I worked, but there he was, pacing, red-faced and furious. He was yelling at the receptionist, demanding to see me. I walked over, keeping my voice calm. You need to leave. He turned to me, eyes wild. So this is where you spend Dad's money, huh? I sighed. Ethan, leave, now. He took a step closer, his voice low and threatening. You have one last chance to do the right thing. Give us our share. I tilted my head. You mean Dad's money? The money he left me because he didn't trust you? That money? His face turned bright red. You're nothing. You know that? You were always nothing. I smiled. Then why do you need my money so badly? Security grabbed him and dragged him out as he kept screaming that I was a selfish, greedy bastard. He got banned from the building. I thought that would finally be the end of it. I was wrong. A few weeks later, I got a letter from a lawyer. Caleb was contesting the will. He claimed our father had been not of sound mind when he wrote it, that I had manipulated him, that the will was unfair and should be overturned. It was complete bullshit. My father had updated his will 3 years ago after Ethan and Caleb stole money from his business. That's right, they had been stealing from him. I didn't know this before, but during the legal process, my lawyer gained access to my father's private financial records, and what I found made me sick. Ethan and Caleb had been stealing from my father for years. They had used his name to take out loans they never paid back. They had written fake business expenses to drain money from his company. My mother knew the whole time. She helped them cover it up. She even pressured my father to keep bailing them out. She had hidden debt notices from him. The reason my father left me everything? Because I was the only one who never stole from him. Because he knew my brothers would squander every penny. Because he finally saw who they really were. I sat there in shock, reading through the documents. My whole life, I had wondered why my father never stood up for me, why he let them treat me like garbage. And now I finally had my answer. He had been weak, he had been manipulated, but in the end, he had tried to make things right. And now, they weren't just trying to guilt-trip me. They were trying to erase the consequences of their own actions. What happens next? The lawsuit was thrown out immediately. My father's lawyer had made sure the will was airtight. Ethan and Caleb were screwed. But just when I thought things were finally over, my mother broke into the house, and that's when things got really ugly. I thought I had finally won. The lawsuit was thrown out. My brothers had no legal way to take anything from me. Ethan had been banned from my workplace. I had blocked their numbers, deleted social media, and ignored every flying monkey they sent my way. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. Then I went to check on my father's house, and I realized my mother had moved in. I had been staying in my own apartment in the city, figuring out what to do with my father's house. When I drove over one afternoon to check on the place, I saw her car in the driveway. I frowned. She had her own condo. Why was she here? I got out of the car and tried my key. It didn't work. She had changed the locks. I banged on the door. After a few seconds, she opened it, wearing my father's old robe and holding a cup of tea like she owned the place. "Oh," she said, like I was an unexpected guest. "You're here." I stared at her. "What the hell are you doing?" She sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "Well, since you're not living here, I figured I might as well stay. I mean, it was my house for decades. It doesn't make sense for it to just sit empty." I clenched my fists. "It's not your house anymore. Dad left it to me. You don't get to just move in." She smiled like she was talking to a child. "Sweetheart, let's be reasonable. I gave birth to you. I raised you. You wouldn't even have this house if not for me." That was when I knew she wasn't planning to leave. I took a deep breath. "You have until tomorrow to get out, or I'll have you removed." Her face hardened instantly. The fake sweetness vanished. "You wouldn't." I stepped closer. "Try me." That night, she sent me a long text message. It was full of emotional blackmail. "You're really gonna throw your own mother out after everything I've done for you? You always hated me, didn't you? This is just your revenge. I hope you know that when I'm gone you'll regret this, but it'll be too late." I didn't reply. The next morning I called my lawyer. Since she wasn't a legal tenant, my lawyer assured me I had every right to evict her. The next morning, I showed up with a locksmith and a police officer. She opened the door, saw them, and immediately collapsed, hand on her chest, breathing heavily. I feel lightheaded," she gasped. The officer frowned. "Do you need medical assistance, ma'am?" She nodded weakly. "I think it's my heart." I rolled my eyes. "She's faking." The officer sighed. "We still need to call an ambulance, just in case." We waited. Paramedics arrived, checked her vitals, and, shocker, she was fine. "You seem healthy," one of them told her, "but stress can have physical symptoms. Maybe some rest will help." I gave her a cold stare. "You have an hour to pack." She went inside, sniffling dramatically as she packed her things. I stood by the door, making sure she took nothing that wasn't hers. Before leaving, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I hope you're happy," she whispered. "You're turning into a cruel, heartless man." I didn't even blink. "Goodbye, Mom." She stormed out. I immediately changed the locks again. I thought that was the end of it. I was so wrong. A week later, I got a letter from her lawyer. Apparently, she was demanding a family provision claim, essentially trying to challenge the will under the argument that she had been wrongfully excluded. Her reasoning? She had sacrificed her whole life for the family and should be compensated. She was financially vulnerable and needed part of the estate to support herself. My father was manipulated into writing her out of the will. It was complete bullshit. She had her own money. She had a fully paid-off condo. She had been complicit in everything Ethan and Caleb had done. I called my lawyer, furious. "Can she actually do this?" He sighed. "It's a long shot. The will is airtight, but this could still drag on for months if she pushes it." I couldn't believe it. She had spent my whole life treating me like an outsider, and now she had the audacity to act like I owed her something. We fought it out in court for months. She hired a lawyer who tried to paint me as a greedy, ungrateful son. He argued that I was emotionally detached and that my father had been pressured into cutting her off. But my father's lawyer had documentation of everything, records showing she had financially enabled Ethan and Caleb for years. Documents proving my father had intentionally removed her from the will. Evidence that she had a fully paid-off home and was far from destitute. The judge dismissed her claim. She got nothing. I sold the house. It held too many bad memories. I moved to a new city, cut off all contact, and started fresh. Ethan and Caleb ended up drowning in debt. Without my father's money, they had no safety net. My mother? I heard through the grapevine that she blamed me for everything. One day, I got an email from one of my father's old business partners. He told me my father had regretted not standing up for me sooner. That he saw what my mother and brothers were doing, but he had been too weak to stop it. His final act, leaving everything to me, was his way of making it right. For the first time in my life, I felt free. Final thoughts. Why do toxic families think they're entitled to the people they hurt the most? I don't regret fighting back. I don't regret cutting them off. The only thing I regret? Not walking away sooner. If you have a toxic family, remember this. You don't owe them anything. They made their choices. Now they can live with them.